16 centuries of Christianity on this island. 1932, as many of you will know, was a landmark year of celebration, which you have to wonder now, what will there be to celebrate in 2032, and who will be around to do the celebrating? That's something we'll consider in our conversation this evening with Mary Kenny and Derek Scally. Nearly 60 years in journalism. I think it's fair to describe Mary as a veteran in the trade or profession, as some people prefer to describe it. She has seen and written and said a lot, much of it indeed relating to the Catholic Church in Ireland. She was a crusading woman's editor of the Irish Press newspaper long ago. She's now a columnist, among other things, in the Irish Catholic. Her new book is called The Way We Were, Catholic Ireland since 1922. It's a wonderful read, and it's a book of two halves. The first half is about that subject. The second half consists of, I think it's 10 profiles of people who've been prominent and who Mary has known very well. She's done some really interesting profiles of them. People like Gail Byrne, Mary Lavin, Frank Duff, Delia Murphy, Peter Sutherland, Deirdre O'Connell, Sean McRaman, and many more, finishing with Sean McBride and Ken Whittaker. Derek Scally is too young to be called a veteran, even though he's been a journalist for, I think, at least a quarter of a century, mostly as German correspondent of the Irish Times. His book, The Best Catholics in the World, which I've no doubt many of you will have read, has been on the shelves for let's say, well over a year. It's been widely praised for its sharp observations, gleaned during a series of reflections and engagements during several return visits to Ireland. Our theme, as you know, is proud legacy or shameful debacle. Perhaps it's both. So much to talk about. And I was hoping perhaps to start by getting a sense from both of you about your own relationship with Catholicism, the phases it's gone through, and what that relationship is like now. How would you characterize it? Is it friendly, angry, disillusioned, hopeful, whatever? Mary, you're first.
Okay, well, I have to say I do identify with Liz Truss in one thing. She keeps changing her mind. And I don't think, some people think that's frivolous. I think that's about growth and learning and having experiences and having new perspectives and revising things. And I grew up in Sandymount in Dublin, and I was a very rebellious young woman. And I thought my father died when I was young, but I thought my elders were absolutely hopelessly stuffy Victorians. And naturally, the natural function of the young person is to rebel against their elders and to overturn the old regime. That's what you're there for, in a way. You've got to bring some fresh thinking to the world. And I was a pioneering feminist in the early 70s. I was a founding member of the Irish Women's Liberation Movement, and I was very, very wild and sometimes very drunk. And so I've been through a lot, and after that I got married and had 2 children, just about in that order. And so life suddenly struck me in a much more serious way when I became a mother, and that there was more, that you couldn't really just, it's not all about sex and drugs and rock and roll. And so, that's been part of my journey. And I suppose I would say I like the way the Jews talk about being an observant Jew. We talk about being practicing Catholics, but I like the idea of being observant. I'm an observant Catholic. I've blown hot and cold with the faith over the years, but it's never let me go, and it is very important to me. And it's been a very nourishing thing in my life, and also it's been something which I feel has expanded my imagination and my journey of reflection, and also my intellectual learning to a great degree as well. So I'm very grateful for it. But of course, I'm also aware, as we learned in our Penny Catechism, that we're all flawed, and plenty of us are very flawed, and one has to see that's the way it is. So I think of myself as an ecumenist as well. I believe that Christians and also especially Jews, whom I look on as very much as the root of our faith, have so much in common to talk about. And to talk with atheists, humanists, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, everybody else as well, because there is, as they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, it's good to identify with the similarities and not just the differences.
Mary, thank you. You mentioned about practicing Catholic. It reminds me of that line, I think it's in Paul Durkin's A Christmas Day. Are you a practicing Catholic? Yes, I practice and I practice and I practice and eventually I get to play. Derek.
Yes, thank you very much for everyone for coming along, and thank you to Columba and to Mary's for this generous invitation. My book has been out a while, some of you may have read it, but I can honestly say Mary's book, I said to her the other evening, Mary, I'm not sure it's like a good wine, should you savour it or just knock it back all at once? It's a real compulsive read, and I really encourage you all to have a look in there, above all for the breadth of knowledge, but also the generosity to people of the opposite side of the debate who perhaps wouldn't have been as generous to Mary. My own faith, to quote the line, I used to be indecisive and now I'm not sure. In the book I talk about myself as a wrestling Catholic, which I suppose is one step above a lapsed Catholic. So I've always had this niggle, particularly since I moved to Germany, that there's something there's something that still hasn't been resolved. So this book was really my attempt to say, right, can I have a parting, an honest parting from Catholicism, like a lot of people in Ireland have just walked away, but I just needed to settle the accounts, and to be honest, I'm still trying to settle those accounts. I would separate Catholic institution, particularly hierarchy, from Catholic faith, and I was in Sweden last week and I was in a graveyard in Uppsala. It was the grave of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Swedish former Secretary General of the United Nations, and I think he was one of the greatest faith seekers of the modern era, and he described faith as the marriage of God and the soul. And I'm single, but I quite like the idea of that marriage. So I'm still seeking, but I think whether you're a practicing Catholic or a lapsed Catholic, we're all Catholic at some description, at some point. And my book is trying to say, we were all there. Let's not pretend we weren't there. Why don't we talk about what happened and how did we get from where we were to where we are? So hopefully this evening's discussion will be part of that.
Yeah, there's a sentence I think in your book, one of many, countless, wonderfully incisive sentences that capture just in a few words a shift or a move, and one that struck me was the in terms of where the Catholic Church is at, an encounter with a priest who wonders how in the blink of an historical eye the Catholic majority has been reduced to a modest, even mocked minority. And Mary, you have a description in your book of an encounter with a group of women in Ennis, which I'd just like to quote briefly. In 2019, I met with a small group of women in Ennis, County Clare, to discuss the waning of what was once called Catholic Ireland. This group of 4 women were in their 40s and early 50s. They were all married and had children. They were sensible, educated, thoughtful and responsible citizens in a medium-sized Irish town that had international links through its proximity to Shannon Airport and a deep hinterland of Irish culture. Clare was once reckoned to be the most Republican of counties in 26 counties of the Irish state, and also amongst the most Catholic. All 4 of the women who participated in the discussion had been brought up as Catholics within practicing Catholic families, where the rosary was usually, though not always, part of the family ritual, and the parents had been more or less conscientious believers. All had gone to faith schools, yet none of the 4 were now believing or practicing Catholics. How has it come to this?
I thought what was interesting too about these 4 women was that none of them had a bad experience, none of them had been abused by a priest, none of them had been treated horribly by nuns. They, in fact, the woman who arranged it for me, she said, you know, the local priest is wonderful, he's so nice, he's really, really kind and good to people. And a young man committed suicide, and the family didn't want a religious service, but the priest just said, just use the church as a space, do whatever you like. And that they were also terrifically good to an immigrant family, an Iraqi family who were in trouble. And so, I mean, she actually praised the pastoral gifts, but she still didn't see any space in her life for faith. Interestingly, she had other things to replace it with. She thought, for example, I think this may be a theme in modern life, the climate change and saving the planet was a kind of purpose in life, which was important to her. And she thought that things like community singing could replace sort of going to church where there is a community. So to me, that was kind of a significant meeting.
Derek, you went back, I think you went to was it the National Library or the Catholic Library, and you took out some of the books that formed the basis of your own religious education, such as it was. Might the weaknesses of that system, as you look back on it now, might that have something by way of an explanation to offer?
Yes, I was born in 1977, so I went to primary school in the 80s, and looking back at those books, all this anger came back, the stupidity from my mind of these books. I felt they were moronic. This was the early 80s attempt. It was experiential learning. It was about getting away from the catechism and learning by rote and so on, and it was about sort of bringing sort of religious experience into everyday life that people could associate with. And I was a teenage Reformation obsessive. I was just found Martin Luther fascinating. I wanted to know about the clash of ideas. I wanted to know about the intellectual end of Catholicism, which I didn't even realise, I wasn't actually ever sure existed until I went to Germany. In Ireland, I felt it was very much a Catholicism that was of the place, of the land, of the people, of the history. It was a little bit too pastoral for my taste, and I think by the time I got into the 80s, it was getting quite tired. But for fairness, I went to people, Maura Highland, I think was named, from Veritas, and I said, what's going on with these books? I found them really stupid. And she said, well, we were between a rock and a hard place. We were the last of three stools. She said there used to be three layers of faith transmission in Ireland. You had church, you had the home, and you had religious instruction. And she said, by the time you came along, everything was balancing on our books. And if everything else had already broken down, all you needed was that last thing to collapse. And it was already gone. So I think I got the last gasp. You know, I came along too late to have been at the belt of the crozier, but I was still old enough to sort of sense that there was something important there, I think, for European history, if nothing else. And so yeah, I'm still a bit of a Reformation obsessive. Living in Germany helps. You know, I always say to people, why are you obsessed with Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones? Read about the Reformation. This happened. This is a battle for control of power of people's minds and hearts and land. It was about money, it was about everything. And I think once you get into that, that's, for many people, I think, could be a way back into Catholicism, or Christianity, even if it is just, let's say, as a sociological, historical idea. But I think from my taste, and again, this is only my subjective experience, I just felt there was a huge intellectual poverty in the Catholic experience in Ireland, which I've now realised, thanks to people, the generous people in the Jesuits and elsewhere, there was always pockets of it, but living elsewhere, I think, has made me cling on to Catholicism more than if I'd been left here with sort of the residual sort of Veritas school book Catholicism that I know.
I'm not sure I'm going to give you this, it'll probably fall apart anyway when I hand it over to you. Some of our audience may remember the Green Catechism. I think this is my copy, my name is kind of scribbled on it, and there are X's and O's on the back of it, and some of the illustrations are...
Read out the first question and see how many people can answer it by
well, for confirmation, your starter for two. I was confirmed by Dr. Michael Brown. One of you you elevated him to the position of Archbishop. I'm not sure which of you it was. I think one of you elevated Connie Lucy in Cork to Archbishop. The other elevated Michael Brown to the position of Archbishop, and neither of them reached that stature, even though both, I suspect, believed they were deserving of it. In any event, for confirmation, I had to know off by heart the first 49 pages of this. So that's up as far as question 186. But sorry if I can find question 1, and all the prayers are there. Yeah. Question 1: Who made the world?
God made the world.
Who is God?
Creation, Lord of all things.
Correct, Mr. McCarter. Why do we call God our Father? We call God our Father because He gave us life and provides for us with fatherly care. It wasn't beaten into us, but certainly, you know, it was a matter of pride and compulsion, I suppose, that, you know, like, and the people who knew it off best were generally put in the front row where His Lordship would do the examining, and Anyway, it was a basis for what a lot of people had by way of religious formation in primary school, up to what, the age of 12, 13, 14.
Yeah, I mean, I want. It's interesting that Derek talks about, you know, his formative years in the 1980s, and I actually agree that I think that a lot of the material that I was seeing in that was terribly soppy, you know, it was all bunny rabbit religion, you know, they were all wonderful.
Butterflies, signs of
butterflies
new life.
and everything like that. Whereas I suppose I, being born in 1944 after all, you know, was very much formed by an older formation. And I wouldn't say that Catholicism, that I got the idea that it lacked intellectual depth, because I think actually Moira Cruz O'Brien wrote a wonderful autobiography called The Same Age as the State, and she writes about, I think she had several uncles who were priests, and they were all terrific scholars. And you know, they knew Greek and...
That's right, it was Monsignor de Bruyne, he was president of the University of Galway, yeah.
Her uncle Paddy, who was absolutely, sounded like a wonderful man, and spent the last night of Sean McDermott's life in prison, he spent it literally in the arms of Paddy Brown, who stayed with him all night before he faced the firing squad in 1916. And that was a generation of really very well-educated Catholics, very, very well-educated people who were very scholarly and so on. And there was that. My own mother had a little bit of this in the sense that, you know, she would have, my father had been at Jesuit schools and so on, and he was much older. My father was actually born in 1877, which is a very, very long time ago. But my mother loved to have some of these Jesuit friends of my father's visit the house, and she would always say, "Oh, he's read all of Balzac, you know." So there was that, and especially an admiration, by the way, for French intellectuals of any kind, for French, the whole link with continental Europe, and the whole idea of, course, people like Jacques Maritain came into all this. So I did get a strong sense that there was an intellectual aspect there. But I also got the sense, you know, Catholicism has 57 varieties. You know, not everybody wants to talk about Soren Kierkegaard all the time. Some people want to have nice, simple Bible stories, if you
But I
like.
can definitely say in suburban Dublin, north side Dublin, by the 1980s, 1990s, it was just ticking over. I think even, it was, I knew there was more there, and so reading you or reading other books has showed me that it's far more interesting than perhaps its reputation is now. But there was a pay and pray element to it, and I think the less people knew, the happier some people in the hierarchy were. And also, you come from middle class background, Mary. I come from more working class background. I think confidence and class consciousness does play a role there.
And yet, though, I mean, okay, you were only 2 at the time, but in 1979 was the year of the Pope's visit to Ireland. 1.25 million turning out in the Phoenix Park. A group of journalists, I was among them. There was an engagement up in, I think it was in the Papal Nunciature, but they sang "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Now, I think it had as much to do with alcoholic intake as it might have to do with, I don't know if the lady nodding in the middle was there as well, but anyway, there was kind of an exuberance about that, and there was Knock, and there was Drogheda, and you know, the Catholic Church and Limerick indeed, and did I mention Galway, and Clonmacnoise and Maynooth. He was cheered to the rafters by, you know, seminarians and religious of all kinds, and the decline. You know, well, I mean, you would say, look, you know, and maybe the first referendum on abortion, which came, you know, just 4 years after that, was a reflection of the confidence that was there on the part of the, I don't know, do you call it the Catholic Church? Do you call it members of the Catholic laity? But you know, it was carried by 2-to-1 majority, and you know, it was. I mean, and there was no doubt about it. I was starting to cover current affairs and politics at that stage. Politicians were very, very careful about you know, engaging in any kind of a critical way with the hierarchy, and I was talking to a friend of mine recently who was growing up. He was growing up in Galway at that time. He would be what, in his mid to late 50s now, and he's an